Xiaodan learned about Chen Hongyu's parole from Aunt Shou. 2 days ago, Xiaodan returned to her hometown to attend a classmate's wedding. After it ended, she impulsively revisited her old neighborhood. Aunt Zhou, their former neighbor, caught her and asked, Dan, how's Xiao Yu doing at the construction site? Is he settling in? Xiaodan was momentarily taken aback. It was only after realizing that Xiao Yu referred to Chen Hongyu that she cautiously asked, Chen Hongyu has been released from prison? You didn't know? I thought he went to find you. Aunt Zhou's expression turned awkward momentarily, then she asked somewhat embarrassedly, was I being too nosy? According to Aunt Zhou, Chen Hongyu had been out of prison for 3 months already. When he returned to his hometown to visit his grandmother's grave, he ran into Aunt Zhou's husband on the way and ended up working on a construction site in City C. He had been out for 3 months in the same city as her, and Aunt Zhou had clearly given him her address, yet he hadn't come to find her. Xiaodan's heart was filled with mixed emotions. Having taken several bus trips and a short ride on a tricycle, Xiaodan finally arrived at the construction site Aunt Zhou had told her about. After getting off the tricycle, she walked along the bumpy stone road for another 10 minutes or so until she stopped in front of a makeshift plastic shed. This was the only food stall on the construction site, run by a middle-aged couple. Except for the landlady, all the workers were sturdy and dark-skinned men. Amidst the chaotic crowd, the stout landlady efficiently served the workers, while some of the men casually groped her buttocks. She merely feigned annoyance and continued with her tasks. Xiaodan didn't pay much attention and approached a group of men drinking and eating with their bare arms exposed. She inquired, "Excuse me, is there someone named Chen Hongyu here? Who are you? What do you want with Chen Hongyu?" The men glanced at each other, eyeing her suspiciously. "I'm a friend of his, looking for him." Xiaodan remained unfazed by their suggestive glances, speaking calmly and confidently. "Chen Hongyu, someone's looking for you, and she's a beauty." One of the men shouted loudly, his eyes fixed on her. At his call, everyone at the food stall turned to look at her, gossiping among themselves. Some even whistled lewdly. A young man with his arms bared stood up from a corner, scanning the crowd. When he saw Xiaodan, he stopped chewing, his expression filled with surprise. "Xiao Chen, is she your girlfriend? Introduce us." Someone jokingly shouted. "Shut up." His gaze swept over the crowd, his voice not loud but sharp, carrying a strong warning. Xiaodan stood under a tree in the distance for several minutes before Chen Hongyu approached her with a bottle of mineral water. He was already wearing worn-out and dirty work clothes, his skin tanned from days of exposure to the sun. He was thin, but his muscles were well-defined. With a crew cut, rugged features, and sharp lines, he looked every bit the mature man. After handing Xiaodan the water, Chen Hongyu avoided her gaze, standing sideways and looking into the distance. "How did you find me? Aunt Zhou told me you're here," Xiaodan said, her eyes scanning the desolate construction site. "When were you released from prison?" "It's been a while. Why didn't you come find me?" "It's not urgent, so." Chen Hongyu. Xiaodan was getting angry. She walked up to him in 2 large steps, looking straight into his eyes. "How many years have we known each other? At the very least, we can consider ourselves friends. We haven't seen each other for so long, and if there's nothing urgent, can't you come find me? If it weren't for Aunt Zhou telling me, were you planning never to come find me?" Chen Hongyu couldn't meet her eyes. He took a step to the side and squatted down, taking out a cigarette from his pocket and lighting it before speaking. "I heard you're doing well now, running a noodle shop, living a good life. Why bother with someone like me? What kind of person do you think you are?" Xiaodan grabbed his cigarette and threw it on the ground, yelling, "Do you think I'm the kind of person who looks down on you because you've been to prison and doesn't want to associate with you? Dan, you know that's not what I mean." "What do you mean then?" Her face contorted with anger. She sneered, "Or is it that you think I'm the reason you went to prison? You hate me, and you don't want to see me?" Den. "Chen Hongyu, do you know why I opened that noodle shop? Because it's something you wanted to do. I wanted to do it for you, thinking I would give it back to you when you came out." Xiaodan's emotions were getting out of control. She couldn't hold back her tears. "But what about you? You've been out for 3 whole months, preferring to endure the wind and sun on this crappy construction site rather than come find me. I had to hear about your release from someone else. Chen Yu, you're such a jerk. Xiaodan cried uncontrollably, trembling all over. Chen Yu, feeling extremely guilty, instinctively reached out to grab her shoulder. Don't gray? Don't touch me. Xiaodan brushed off his hand. Tell me what you're thinking. If you really don't want to see me, I'll never come find you again. Seeing Xiaodan like this broke his heart. Without thinking, he hugged her tightly. Dan, why would I not want to see you? For the past 6 years, I've been thinking about you every moment. I was just afraid you wouldn't want to see me. Half a month later, Chen Yu showed up at Xiaodan's noodle shop with a backpack. The shop wasn't large, only about 30 square meters, with 10 tables neatly arranged. Xiaodan had hired a chef, a waitress, and a dishwasher. The 4 of them had been running the noodle shop lively for several years, and it was well known in the neighborhood, with business thriving. Chen Yu stood at the door, looking at the slightly worn-out signboard. The 4 dimly colored characters of Hongyu Noodle Shop stabbed his heart. As a man who had been through storms, the heart in his chest was sour and bitter at this moment, and his eyes turned red with bitterness. It was a little after 3 in the afternoon, the quietest time for the noodle shop. The chef and the waitress had gone back to rest, and the dishwasher was dozing off. Xiaodan prepared a brazier at the door for him to step over to ward off bad luck. She personally cooked a bowl of pig trotter noodles for him. Chen Yu stared at the steaming bowl of noodles in front of him, feeling a little dazed. He didn't move his chopsticks for a long time. These were things he should have done more than 3 months ago when he was released from prison. But now, he was alone in the world, with no family and no one to think so much for him. But Xiaodan had been worried about him all along. Eat while it's hot. Xiaodan said, try it and see if it tastes like Grandma Lu's. He picked up the chopsticks, took a bite, and the long-lost, familiar taste spread over his taste buds. Chen Yu couldn't control himself, and tears welled up in his eyes. He ate faster and faster, devouring the food like a refugee who hadn't eaten a full meal in a long time, and tears rolled into the bowl along with his emotions. Xiaodan felt uncomfortable too. Pretending not to notice, she got up and went back to the kitchen to busy herself. After Chen Yu finished eating and his mood improved a bit, she came out again. You must be tired. Let me take you back to rest for a while. After the waitress and the kitchen chef returned one after another, Xiaodan greeted them and took Chen Yu back home. She lived in a dilapidated residential building awaiting demolition, about a 15-minute walk from the noodle shop. Last month, the young couple upstairs had moved out, leaving the house empty. After seeing Chen Yu, she had rented the house. It was a 1-bedroom apartment, fully furnished, just right for 1 person. Xiaodan had cleaned the house in advance, scrubbing it inside and out with laundry detergent, and the bed sheets and covers were ready, neatly spread out on the bed. You can stay here for now. When you find a suitable place later, you can move. I'll be living downstairs. Xiaodan opened the curtains and the tightly closed windows, and sunlight flooded in, brightening up the whole room. You rest first. I have to go back to the shop. If there's anything, we'll talk about it when I come back tonight. After Xiaodan left, Chen Yu looked around the room, glanced out the window at the dilapidated surroundings, listened to the distant cries of vendors in the market, and the crying of children next door. Satisfied, he closed his eyes, took a deep breath of the air filled with the scent of food, and lay down on the bed. It had been a long time since he had felt such a lively atmosphere. The elements of peace and contentment seeped into his pores and flowed through his body along with his blood. He fell into a deep sleep, only to be awakened by Xiaodan knocking on his door when she returned. Are you hungry? This is the beef noodles from the shop, specially packed for you to take away. Xiaodan placed the noodles on the table and took out 2 dark-colored short-sleeved shirts from the bag. These are the clothes I bought in the market this afternoon. You can wear them for now. Later, we'll go to the mall and pick out 2 more. Chen Yu looked at her silently, without speaking. Compared to before, she hadn't changed much. She was slim, with a fair complexion, her long hair tied up, with 2 strands of loose hair falling in front of her forehead, making her look delicate. But between her eyebrows, there was a touch of resilience and maturity that had come from weathering hardships. "Do you have a boyfriend?" he suddenly asked, not knowing why he asked. Xiaodan's movements paused, then she said lightly, "No." Chen Hongyu didn't say anything more and started to eat the noodles on the table. The next day, Chen Hongyu followed Xiaodan to the noodle shop and learned how to make noodles with the shop's chef. When his grandmother was alive, she used to run a small noodle shop at the school gate, and he often helped out, so learning it was effortless for him. A few days later, he became acquainted with the people in the shop. The waitress secretly pulled him aside to gossip. "Brother Hongyu, what's the relationship between you and sister Xiaodan? Why did she even name the shop after you?" Chen Hongyu didn't know how to answer for a moment. After thinking for a while, he smiled and said, "I'm her neighbor's brother. We grew up together since we were kids." Oh, childhood sweethearts? Childhood sweethearts. What a beautiful term. Could it really be used to describe them? He wasn't sure. Before becoming his little sweetheart, Xiaodan was the enviable daughter of an official. Her father was the deputy mayor, but after he was arrested for corruption, she became a fallen daughter and ended up next door to Chen Hongyu's house, becoming his little sweetheart. That year, Chen Hongyu was 11 and Xiaodan was 10. When his mother took Xiaodan back to her grandmother's house, she seemed so out of place in the dirty and messy little village. Faced with dirty and rough-dressed children of the same age, she seemed like a princess from a castle, isolated from the world. When a corrupt official was being condemned, the children of the corrupt official would also be reviled. Xiaodan, who was thrown into her grandmother's house by her mother, didn't have a good life. The neighbors pointed fingers at her and instigated their children to ostracize her. Only Chen Hongyu was willing to be her friend. At that time, children of 11 didn't understand anything. They would gather together to play marbles and fight with paper cards. But because his parents had died early, Chen Hongyu was much more mature than them. He didn't like their childish behavior and was used to being alone, often contemplating life and exploring the outside world by himself. The first time he saw Xiaodan, Chen Hongyu was stunned. Xiaodan had beautiful, soft, shoulder-length hair, wore a princess dress with lace trim, white knee socks, and pink leather shoes. She seemed to come from another world, a world that Chen Hongyu had always been curious about and longed for. When everyone ostracized her and bullied her, Chen Hongyu bravely stood in front of her, playing the role of a knight and protecting her well. Xiaodan's appearance opened up his understanding of the new world. How could someone be so good-looking, so good at studying, and also proficient in singing, dancing, reciting, and painting? Thus, Xiaodan became a mythical figure in Chen Hongyu's heart, and she made him realize that Xiaodan was an unreachable star to him, someone he could only admire from afar. In front of Xiaodan, he felt inferior, so inferior that he silently protected her for so many years, liked her for so many years, but never dared to say it out loud. When he felt her getting close, he was afraid and tried to escape, and in the end, he even pushed her to someone else. Thinking about this, Chen Hongyu wished he could slap himself a few times and ask himself what he was thinking back then. Xiaodan said that the noodle shop was open for Chen Hongyu, and the taste was all based on Grandma Lu's craft. The taste was excellent, the prices were affordable, and it became a signboard in the area. Many workers in the area liked to come here to eat, and the shop was almost full every day. Chen Hongyu spent all day busy in the noodle shop, smelling the familiar smell that belonged to his grandmother, and could see Xiaodan when he looked up. He felt particularly solid, as if everything had returned to the past, and the 6 years of separation and disintegration had never happened. Days went by like this, busy yet fulfilling. They interacted like ordinary colleagues, never crossing the line of friendship. The chubby aunt from the vegetable market, who supplied vegetables to the noodle shop, was a warm-hearted woman. She had a good relationship with Xiaodan and liked this strong and independent girl very much. Whenever she heard of any eligible unmarried men, she would immediately think of matchmaking for her. One afternoon during leisure time, she came to the noodle shop carrying a small bag of melon seeds. Xiaodan had just gone out, so Chen Hongyu poured her a glass of water and greeted her. As she cracked melon seeds, the chubby aunt stared at him, increasingly impressed by how good-looking this young man was. With thick eyebrows and big eyes, well-defined features, he exuded a strong masculine charm. It was just a pity that he was a laborer. After learning his name was Hongyu from the dishwasher aunt, the chubby aunt's gossip heart was ignited. Xiaodan named the noodle shop after him. Could it be that there was something between them? Hongyu, don't be busy. Sit down and chat for a while. The chubby aunt smiled and pushed the melon seeds across the table. Once Chen Hongyu sat down, she looked at him with shining eyes and asked, "What's your relationship with Dan Dan?" It was the same question again. He had heard it many times and had answered it many times. "I'm her brother." "Hi, brother." The chubby aunt suddenly laughed, the joy in her eyes undisguised. "I thought you were Dan Dan's boyfriend. Being a brother is good. I came today to introduce a boyfriend to Dan Dan. He's a civil servant with a stable job, a secure position. He's a year older than Dan Dan. This is a top-notch marriage." The chubby aunt prattled on, but Chen Hongyu didn't hear anything. He just stared at her, lips moving. He clearly hoped Xiaodan could find a good man and live happily for the rest of her life, but at this moment, he couldn't feel happy. His head felt like it had been run over by a steamroller, and he couldn't figure out what expression he should give. Xiaodan returned soon after. The chubby aunt exaggerated the other party's conditions again, and finally pointed at Chen Hongyu and said, "Your brother also says the conditions are good. Go and see him. Maybe your personalities match, and the marriage will be settled." "My brother?" Xiaodan murmured, her gaze falling on Chen Hongyu at the next table. Perhaps feeling guilty, he didn't dare to look at her, just bowed his head to pick vegetables. "Xiaodan snortet coldly." "Then, little Yuji, shall I go see him?" Chen Hongyu didn't say anything. His hand picking vegetables paused for a moment. Then he abruptly snapped the vegetables in half. "Go ahead." Xiaodan went on a blind date that evening. Chen Hongyu accidentally burned his hand due to distraction. Seeing that the shop wasn't very busy, the kitchen chef let him go home early. Before leaving, he reminded Chen Hongyu to buy some medicine from the pharmacy. Chen Hongyu agreed verbally, but once he stepped out of the shop, he went straight back home. He didn't want to apply the medicine because his heart felt like it had been twisted into a pretzel all night. The burning sensation on his hand could at least alleviate some of the discomfort he felt inside. Upon entering his home, he gulped down a bottle of ice-cold mineral water and then lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling without moving. Time passed by minute, and the burning sensation in his hand didn't ease up at all. Unbeknownst to him, a small blister had formed on his hand. After some time, there was a knock on the door. It was Xiaodan. She came carrying a large bag of beer and snacks, smiling brightly at him. "Let's have some late-night snacks together." Without waiting for his response, she entered the house and laid out the food on the table. Chen Hongyu followed her in, hesitating before asking, "How was the blind date? Did it go well?" "It went pretty well." She opened a bottle of beer and placed it in front of him, then opened one for herself. "Come, sit down." She had bought a lot of snacks, including peanuts, duck necks, duck wings, duck gizzards, and duck intestines, as well as dried tofu and pig's trotters, all of which were braised dishes that Chen Hongyu loved. "That guy looks really good, just a little less than you. But his conditions are really good. His family has a 5-story house in his hometown, and he has 2 other houses in the city. One for his parents to live in, and the other one is being prepared as their marital home. It's over 120 square meters. His family also has 2 small storefronts that they can rent out." Xiaodan drank beer and ate meat heartily, telling him about the blind date today. "He also has a great personality, witty and humorous. He even told me a cold joke today. Let me tell you." She sat up straight, vividly describing the blind date's situation. One day, Xiaoming ran home crying. His mother asked him what was wrong. He said, "Mom, everyone calls me a silly child. Am I really a silly child?" His mother patted his head and said, "Silly child, how could you be a silly child? Ha ha ha. Isn't it funny? It's so funny that my stomach hurts. Xiaodan was obviously a bit drunk, laughing exaggeratedly, leaning on the table, panting, tears streaming down her face. Chen Hongyu looked at her like this, feeling very uncomfortable. He took the beer bottle from her hand and said, "Stop drinking." "Why should I stop drinking?" Xiaodan suddenly stopped laughing, snatched the beer bottle back, and drank it all in one gulp. Then, with a flushed face, she looked at him. "If I don't drink, how are we going to talk about our relationship?" Saying that, she opened another can of beer. Chen Hongyu grabbed her hand and said, "You're allergic to alcohol. If you drink more, you'll feel uncomfortable later. Would you care?" Xiaodan stared into his eyes, her eyes red. After a moment of eye contact without getting an answer, she suddenly laughed. "Since you don't care, why bother about whether I'm allergic or not?" Her demeanor was a bit wild as she grabbed the beer bottle, ready to continue drinking. Chen Hongyu stood up and took the bottle from her. "Den den, dalm down." Xiaodan stood up with the force he exerted on her wrist, tiptoed, hugged his neck, and kissed him on the lips. Her kissing technique was erratic, neither skilled nor gentle, but filled with anger as she roughly kissed his lips. Chen Hongyu was stunned for a moment. When he realized something was wrong, he immediately pushed her away. Dan, don't do this." Xiaodan staggered, almost falling down. Chen Hongyu grabbed her again, and she bumped back into his arms. She looked up at him, her crimson eyes shimmering with a layer of teary water, her pupils bright like stars, but filled with a sense of powerlessness. "You used to like me, didn't you? Why won't you let me kiss you?" "Huh." In Chen Hongyu's shocked and helpless gaze, she approached step by step. "Or is it because I'm not clean anymore, not the little princess in your heart, so you dislike me and reject me?" Dan, don't do this. You're drunk. Let me take you back to rest," Chen Hongyu said, trying to comfort her. "Chen Hongyu, stop avoiding the issue, okay?" Xiaodan suddenly shook off his hand that reached out to help her, shouting loudly, "You obviously used to like me, so why do you keep pushing me towards others? You did it in college, and you're doing it now." Chen Hongyu froze. Memories of the unbearable past in college rushed back to him, swallowing him like a raging beast, making him unable to breathe. Xiaodan walked slowly towards him, her voice hoarse as she said, "I, Xiaodan, have only liked you, Chen Hongyu, since I was a child. I've been waiting for you to come out for so many years. If..." She paused for a moment and continued, "If you still like me and don't dislike me, then don't push me away." Her eyes lost the scary hostility from before, shimmering with anticipation as she looked at him. Seeing that he didn't resist, she hugged his neck again and kissed his lips. This time, she was very gentle, pecking lightly and sucking gently, trying to make this kiss beautiful. This time, Chen Hongyu didn't push her away. Looking at her gently closed eyes and eyelashes wet with tears, the high walls in his heart collapsed. He hugged Xiaodan's frail body tightly, taking the initiative, kissing her soft lips eagerly and passionately. As their bodies heated up, their rationality was burned by desire, and the emotions of over a decade erupted in this moment, sweeping over them like a tsunami, difficult to resist. In a moment, the two of them had rolled onto the bed, kissing passionately while removing each other's clothes. But just as Chen Hongyu unbuttoned her clothes and his rough hands covered her flat stomach, she suddenly let out a terrifying scream, pushing Chen Hongyu off her with all her might, curling up and trembling. Chen Hongyu's desire instantly extinguished as he looked at Xiaodan in confusion and uncertainty, not daring to approach her. He could only tremble and say, "I won't touch you. I won't touch you. Dan, don't be afraid." Before the age of 10, Xiaodan was a little princess, a precious gem held in the palms of her parents, treasured and cherished, fearing she might be dropped or melted away. After the age of 10, her father was arrested, her mother left after abandoning her to her grandmother, and soon after, her mother formed a new family. She was abandoned in that backward village, becoming the disgraceful burden in her grandmother's eyes. During her long journey of growing up, only Chen Hongyu still treated her like a princess, always protecting her. Even if he went against the world, he would smile and say to her, "Dan Dan, don't be afraid. CUG will protect you." Watching his warm smile, Xia Dan silently said in her heart, "Okay, you protect me. When I grow up, I will repay you with my whole heart." Although Xia Dan was despised by the villagers, everyone knew that these two children were close, so they tacitly agreed that they would be a couple in the future. Fortunately, Jin Hongyu's grandmother was a kind and reasonable old woman who never blamed the children for the mistakes of the adults. She also cared for Xia Dan, the poor child, very much. The two lonely souls leaned on each other, went to school together, grew up together, and even entered the same university. At that time, Xia Dan no longer had the appearance of a princess, but she was still beautiful, with a noble temperament different from ordinary people. Although Chen Hongyu was handsome, he was always teased by friends as not being good enough for her when standing in front of Xia Dan. Chen Hongyu didn't mind and smiled, saying, "Of course, our Dan Dan is so beautiful, kind, lovely, and charming. There's no one in the world who can match her." He said this sincerely, truly feeling that no one was worthy of Xia Dan, not even himself. Later, he met Lu Wenchuan. Lu Wenchuan was a rich second generation, handsome, and wealthy. He could sing, dance, play sports, and even race cars. He was the prince charming in the dreams of all the girls in school. Such a versatile man somehow became Chen Hongyu's buddy. Lu Wenchuan was very loyal and had never looked down on him as a loser buddy. Their relationship was very close. So when Lu Wenchuan confessed that he liked Xia Dan, Chen Hongyu hesitated for 2 days. He thought that if Xia Dan ever wanted a boyfriend, someone like Lu Wenchuan would be the most suitable. With this in mind, Chen Hongyu chose to suppress his own feelings and set them up. Lu Wenchuan publicly pursued Xia Dan, constantly sending flowers and gifts, and his confessions were full of creativity. This romantic love story became a popular topic on campus for a while. However, Xia Dan bluntly rejected Lu Wenchuan and angrily found Chen Hongyu to question him. "Why did you help him pursue me? Do you really want me to be his girlfriend? He's pretty good, he can do everything, and he looks good. You two are a perfect match." Chen Hongyu said insincerely, still smiling brightly but looking like a fool. After staring at him for a long time, Xia Dan dropped a sentence, "You jerk," and then turned and walked away. They had a fight because of this, and they didn't speak for more than a week. It wasn't until Xia Dan's birthday that Lu Wenchuan, who was more determined than ever, found Chen Hongyu and asked him to help arrange a meeting with Xia Dan, saying he had prepared a surprise. Chen Hongyu sent a message to Xia Dan, asking her to meet at a restaurant themed around lovers. Xia Dan thought he had come to his senses and was going to confess to her, so she reluctantly agreed. She dressed up beautifully that day and went to the restaurant, full of joy, to meet the boy she had always liked so much, but that night turned into the biggest nightmare of her life and became the decision Chen Hongyu regretted most in his life. That night's loss of control was silently acknowledged by both of them. Chen Boya knew well that what happened 6 years ago had become a shadow in Xia Dan's heart, one that might accompany her for the rest of her life, impacting her happiness. What should he do? How could he help her overcome this shadow? The next day, Xia Dan found Aunt Pang, politely declining her matchmaking attempts, and her relationship with Chen Boya became even closer. They often reminisced about the happy days of the past, occasionally going to watch movies or strolling on the streets during their leisure time. Their life was warm and beautiful, as if nothing had ever happened, living their days peacefully and contentedly. However, all this tranquility was shattered by Yang Meifang. Yang Meifang was Xia Dan's mother, the one who abandoned her at her grandmother's house for over a decade. Upon learning that Chen Boyer was released from prison and was now with Xia Dan, she stormed angrily to their doorstep. Pointing at Chen Boyer, she yelled, "Chen, how dare you come to see Xia Dan? Who was responsible for her rape back then?" "Mom," Xia Dan yelled, interrupting her, "what exactly do you want?" The word rape deeply pierced her heart, suffocating her and leaving her breathless. She had hidden and escaped for so many years, starting a new life in a place where nobody knew her past. Yet, her own mother easily uncovered her past, ruthlessly poking at her wounds. The shop hadn't opened yet, and there were no customers inside. But the chef and the dishwasher auntie were busy in the kitchen. Hearing the silence inside, Xiaodan knew that her secret was now out in the open. I haven't even talked about you yet. Do you have any self-respect? Look at what he did to you. Yet, you're still with him. Why did I give birth to such an incompetent daughter like you? Yang Meifeng's character had once been gentle, but after her husband's arrest, she was ridiculed by everyone. She couldn't hold her head up anywhere she went. Eventually, she even suffered from depression. Over the years, she transformed into the current shrewish appearance. Why didn't you just kill me when I was born? Since my dad was arrested, you abandoned me to my grandmother. Why bother interfering now? Xiaodan seemed to be on the verge of collapse, shouting without restraint. Exactly. Let's talk about your dad. He's already dead in prison. You want a boyfriend who's been in jail? Are you planning to stick with prison for the rest of your life? Can't you have a little dignity and think about your future? Yang Meifeng had no guilt in her eyes as she glared at Chen Boyu. Yes, I have no dignity. I want to be with Chen Boyu. So what? We want to get married and have children. We want to be happy together for the rest of our lives. With a loud slap, Yang Meifeng's hand landed on Xiaodan's face, leaving a bright red handprint. Auntie, Xiaodan is your daughter. How can you lay a hand on her? Chen Boyu finally reacted, standing in front of Xiaodan, holding her trembling hand tightly, giving her endless strength. Who do you think you are to say that? Get out of here. Stay away from my daughter. Yang Meifeng finally realized what she had done. Unable to deal with Xiaodan, she grabbed Chen Boyu and tried to drag him out. Mom, please don't disrupt my life anymore, okay? I beg you. Xiaodan knelt in front of Yang Meifeng, crying hysterically. Yang Meifeng looked at her incredulously, firmly believing that her daughter had been bewitched by Chen Boyu. In a fit of anger, she grabbed a nearby stool and threw it at him. Chen Boyu, I'll kill you. If it weren't for you, Dan wouldn't. Her voice abruptly stopped as the stool heavily hit Xiaodan's head. She fell into Chen Boyu's arms, blood flowing from her dark hair, stinging Chen Boyu's eyes. The scene from 6 years ago, covered in blood, flashed before his eyes once again. After Xiaodan's incident, she disappeared without a trace, and Chen Boyu couldn't find her no matter how hard he tried. It wasn't until a week later, accompanied by Yang Meifeng, that she appeared at the school and brought Lu Wenchuan to court on charges of rape. At that time, Xiaodan seemed lifeless, her eyes vacant. Even in the scorching summer, she wore long clothes and trousers, walking with her head down, no longer resembling the princess she once was. Chen Boyu went mad. He searched for Xiaodan, but she was nowhere to be found. He looked for Lu Wenchuan, but Lu Wenchuan was protected by his family. He was like a fly in need of release, but without a head, crashing everywhere, injuring himself in the process. On the day of the trial, Chen Boyu went. Xiaodan sat with her head down in the plaintiff's seat, her long hair covering her face. Chen Boyu couldn't see her expression clearly, but he noticed that she had significantly lost weight. In contrast, Lu Wenchuan, sitting in the defendant's seat, was calm and unrepentant. During the trial, he claimed that it was consensual and presented a bunch of so-called evidence. As expected, Xiaodan lost the case against the rich second-generation Lu Wenchuan. Outside the courtroom, Chen Boyu caught up with Xiaodan. Looking at her lifeless face, he didn't know what to say. Xiaodan looked up at him. Her eyes, once bright like stars, now devoid of soul, seemed to slowly torture him. She said, Chen Boyu, I never want to see you again. Please leave my world. This was the last thing Xiaodan said to Chen Boyu 6 years ago. She disappeared like this, and Chen Boyu searched everywhere for her but never found her. One night later, Chen Boyu caught Lu Wenchuan coming out of a bar and beat him to near death. Lu Wenchuan ended up in the ICU, and as expected, Chen Boyu was sentenced to 7 years in prison, prematurely ending his college career. A year later, his grandmother passed away, and he was allowed to attend the funeral upon his release from prison. Shortly after the funeral, Xiaodan went to the prison to see him. After seeing Chen Boyu's current state, Washed away by time, Xiaodan softened. Even though the incident was related to Qin Boyo, it wasn't his fault. Moreover, his kindness to her far outweighed any harm he caused. She knew that if given the choice, Qin Boyo would rather give up his life than let her suffer any harm. How could she blame someone so good to her? Seeing Qin Boyo's haggard appearance, his brows furrowed with self-blame, seemingly never relaxed, Xiaodan tried to smile and asked him in a light tone, "What do you want to do after coming out?" Qin Boyo's eyes turned red instantly. He had thought that if they met again, Xiaodan would hit him or scold him, and he would willingly accept it. But Xiaodan, as usual, looked at him with such a beautiful smile, asking him with such ordinary and simple words that warmed his heart. After a long pause, he hoarsely said, "I want to open a noodle shop and continue Grandma's taste." She said, "Okay, let's open a noodle shop." Before leaving, Qin Boyo stopped her and said, Dan, don't come to see me anymore in the future." Xiaodan smiled and said, "Okay, I'll wait to see you when you come out." After Xiaodan left, she found a shop, learned how to make noodles, followed Grandma's teachings from memory, tried and tried again until she recreated the similar taste of the broth and found Grandma's flavor. Xiaodan had lost her dreams long ago, but from that day on, Qin Boyo's wish became her goal to strive for. Xiaodan's injuries were not severe, just a slight concussion. After the wound was stitched up, she stayed in the hospital for a few days. When she woke up in the hospital, Yang Meifang's worriedly furrowed brows relaxed, but then she put on a stern face and said, "I don't care about you two. If you encounter hardships in the future, don't come crying to me." After saying this, she left behind a bank card with 50,000 yuan in it. It was her secret savings accumulated over the years, intended to be used as a dowry for Xiaodan. Xiaodan grabbed the bank card, crying uncontrollably. She actually had some savings. The business of the noodle shop had been good these past 2 years, and she had saved up enough money to buy a small house in City C and renovate it nicely. However, she couldn't refuse the card. It was the first time in many years since her mother abandoned her to her grandmother that she felt the warmth of being loved. After being discharged from the hospital, many familiar customers brought fruits to the shop to see her. The kitchen chef and the dishwasher auntie didn't mention the incident from that day and chatted and laughed with her as usual, as if nothing had happened. Soon, it was Xiaodan's birthday. In that dilapidated residential building, in the cramped little room, Qin Boyo meticulously prepared dinner. There was red wine, candles, flowers, romantic music, and a flower path laid out with rose petals. Qin Boyo knelt in front of Xiaodan, holding a slender ring, and proposed to her, Dan, if you don't mind that I have nothing, if you don't mind that I've been to prison, will you marry me?" Xiaodan didn't expect all of this from him and covered her mouth, unable to speak. Dan, in the past, I was too inferior, thinking that I wasn't worthy of you, which is why I repeatedly ignored your feelings. But it won't happen again. I will love you and cherish you, make up for the suffering you've endured these years, and the mistakes I've made. Dan, give me a chance to take care of you, okay? Qin Boyo looked at her with sincere eyes, full of anticipation. Xiaodan burst into tears and remained motionless for a long time. Qin Boyo reached out to put the ring on her finger, but Xiaodan suddenly clenched her fist and avoided the ring that was about to slide onto her finger. "What's wrong?" Dan, Qin Boyo called her. Xiaodan stepped back, wiped her tears, and choked out, "I'm sorry, Yu. Let's just stay as we were before. Don't be lovers, just be friends." She didn't say the second part of the sentence. "Why?" Qin Boyo stood up and walked over to her. "No reason." She sniffled and forced a smile. "I drank too much that night, and I acted impulsively towards you. And what I said about marrying you was just said out of anger to my mom. Don't take it to heart. Let's forget about all this, okay?" Qin Boyo saw the despair in her eyes through her watery gaze. He knew what she was afraid of and gently embraced her. After a long silence, he whispered in her ear, Dan, don't be afraid. Whatever difficulties we face, we'll overcome them together." Xiaodan understood that Qin Boyo knew what was on her mind. She hesitated for a long time before slowly saying, "I thought everything was over, but that night, I couldn't control. Her eyes pressed against his shoulder, sobbing. I don't think I'll ever be okay." "It's okay, Dan." He stroked her back gently and said softly, "Trust me, it will get better." His voice was soft but firm, like a reassuring pill, soothing her anxious heart. Chun Boyo let go of her and looked at her tear-streaked face. He gently kissed her tear-filled eyes, feeling her body tremble slightly. He reached out and held her hands, which were clenched into fists, in his warm palms, slowly helping her to relax her fists and interlocking their fingers. His kisses moved downward, from her eyes to her forehead, her nose, her lips, and then her neck, all the way down. Whenever Xiaodan felt something was off, he immediately stopped to comfort her, looking into her eyes and saying, "Don't be afraid, Dan, it's me, I'm Xiu." As they undressed each other again, Xiaodan trembled all over again, as if she was having a nightmare, her eyes filled with fear. Chin Boyer immediately covered her with the blanket, comforting her. "Don't be afraid, Dan, I won't touch you anymore." He sat up, but Xiaodan suddenly grabbed his hand, her eyes wet with tears, fear and determination colliding in her eyes. She trembled as she said, "Xiu, let's continue." "It's okay, take it slow, we have plenty of time." Chun Boya held her hand back, his eyes full of tenderness. "No, if we don't push forward, we'll always stay here." Seeing the determination in her eyes, Chin Boya didn't refuse anymore. He bent down, looking deeply into her eyes, and said affectionately, "If it doesn't work, you must tell me." "Okay." Epilogue. The morning sunlight streamed through the curtains, filling the room with warmth. Xiaodan leaned against Chin Boya's arm, opening her palm and squinting through the gaps between her fingers, basking in the sunlight. That was the look of happiness. From now on, she would bid farewell to unhappiness and embrace every beautiful today and tomorrow with Chin Boya, as well as the hopeful future. Under the sunlight, a ring suddenly slipped onto her fair fingers, and a dark hand stretched out next to hers. The two rings reflected dazzling light. She turned to look, Chin Boyu, with sleepy eyes, smiling at her. She felt as if time was rapidly rewinding, back to the appearance of the young boy years ago. That smile was beautiful and warm, the only brightness in her entire teenage years. Dan, can you accept my proposal now?" His voice, still hoarse from just waking up, was incredibly pleasant to hear. "Yeah." Xiaodan nodded, planting a kiss on his stubbly chin, then took his hand and quietly admired the two sparkling rings. From now on, may the heavens watch over them, may time be gentle, and may they never be separated again.